So, welcome everybody. I know this is Mayo time, not quite German precision, but just a little bit after time. You're all very welcome to this evening's celebration of Paul Durcan's 80th birthday with readings from Paul Durcan, 80 at 80. In fact, we in Achill, due to our westerly time zone, are a little late in celebrating, as Paul is now 80 years and 6 months old. It is, however, most important that the Achill Heinrich Böll organization recognizes the important role Paul played in securing the Heinrich Böll cottage for posterity as an artist's residence. He had spent time in the residence prior to its acquisition from the Böll family and supported the proposal for state funding to buy the cottage. He was present in person at the Museum of Country Life, Turlough, on the 9th of September 2001, supporting the Heinrich Böll Committee and the late Donncha O'Gallagher, former Minister for the Gaeltacht, in negotiations with the then Minister of State for Arts, Sheila de Valera. And this resulted in the first capital grant towards buying the cottage, which was then turned into an artist's residence. In a letter attached to the proposal, Durcan stated, "The whole project of the Heinrich Böll cottage is constantly validated by a sense of the presence of the original writer, resident himself, as the master author who understood the necessity of privacy and the rightness of solitude." Durcan, already with strong Mayo roots, fell in love with Dugort and befriended neighbours including Michael Carr, then caretaker of the Böll House, and Vi McDougall, the doyenne of the colony. Paul bought a site from Vi, and Porrick Carr, son of Michael, designed and built his Dugort home. Porrick Carr was a gifted architect who also restored the Böll cottage, retaining much of its original character. Porrick, who had become a close friend of Paul's, sadly passed away in recent times. The 80 poems in this carefully selected anthology, edited by Niall McMonigal, were distilled from some 19 books of poems published between 1975 and 2016. The poems range in theme from the personal, love, loss, loneliness, to contemporary news events such as the divorce referendum, Ireland 1986, or such happenings as 6 nuns die in convent inferno. He can be self-critical and hard on himself, especially when dealing with such issues as his failed marriage and his difficult relationship with his father. His poems are generally very accessible, but their popularity is further enhanced by the poet himself reading and his unique voice. Colm Tobin, in his introduction to the anthology, writes, "His voice could be deadpan and dead serious. It could also be wildly comic and brilliantly indignant. Durcan's poems are risk-taking explorations of where tragedy and comedy meet in contemporary Ireland. His radio broadcasts are legendary and brought him huge popularity." This evening, Paul himself cannot be here due to his frail health, but sends warm greetings to you all, and we send warm congratulations on his 80th birthday, plus 6 months back to him. Therefore, we will hear readings selected from Paul Durcan, 80 at 80, and other works from his friends and admirers, including Dermot Bulger, Geraldine Mitchell, Michael O'Loughlin, Sheila McHugh, and Hans Christian Ozer. Each reader will introduce the poems in their context and add any personal anecdotes about their own connection with Paul. You all have a resume of the readers' biographies, so in order to save time, and as there are many selected poems, I will avoid introducing individual readers. The order this evening will be music which is kindly being supplied by our talented duo, Ackle duo, harpist Leisha Kelly and fiddle player Diarmid Gilty. And they will start the evening with music which they will introduce. Then the order of speakers will be Dermot Bolger, Geraldine Mitchell with an interlude of music, then Sheila McHugh, Hans Christian Ozer, then an interval of music, and then Michael O'Loughlin, then a surprise, and then music to tidy up the evening. So sit back and enjoy these wonderful readers.
Thank you, Dr. King, Edward. Lovely to be here, and this very warm atmosphere for Paul Durcan. And we had the chance to play like this in one of his evenings in Gilty's, and I'll never forget it because I'd never seen him live before, and all you know him. He was so much more than just the poet, wasn't he? When he was an actor, he came to life, and it was just hilarious, absolutely enthralling, entertaining. So we'll start with something like that for us, which is, they're kind of like barn dances, but they're called flings. So for Paul, the Road to Glanthon, Cos Teehins, and something else. That's right, Dermot.
That's right.
Do you want to talk there?
Well, no, just as Leisha mentioned, the night we were fortunate, we were invited by John McHugh. I think it was actually the college, the university from the States. There were a group of students back, and we had a lovely, intimate evening in Gilty's. It was great, and of course Paul was wearing his mustard-coloured jumper, which lit up the venue and lit up everybody, put everyone in great moods. But as I said, it was a fantastic evening. It's a pity. I know we're sending our love to him, and I know he'd love to be here, but we hope you all enjoy what we're going to do for Paul this evening. So we'll start off.
much that I always felt that I knew the place, even though I'd never been here, but it's lovely to be here. I've read with Paul in so many places, in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and Toronto years later, and Amsterdam and The Hague and London and Paris and various places around Ireland. So it's really strange doing a Paul Durcan reading without Paul Durcan. Nobody can read like Paul Durcan, and so I think nobody will attempt it tonight. But I remember driving home from football one night and listening to a U2 song sung by Johnny Cash, and it sounded okay. So hopefully the Paul Durcan poems not read by Paul Durcan will sound okay. The very first time I read with Paul Durcan was 49 years ago, and I was 16 years of age, and it was the first time I was ever published in an anthology. It was called Profiles 1, and I was just added to the anthology at the end, and backstage because as I was who's going to read, and I wasn't meant to read, and I was really nervous. I was a little kid from school, and there was disputes, and then this voice behind me said, "Let Dermot read." And it was Paul Durcan doing his very stern voice, and I was allowed to read on stage, and we became great friends from that. And it was in the Player Wills Theatre in Dublin, and I remember being backstage and listening to Paul read this poem. And so I picked this. I picked the poems I picked were some the early books, because I was Paul's publisher for a while, and I know he published 19 books. The three that Raven has published are the most collectible because they had the most misprints, because we were very enthusiastic. We just very good proofreaders, you know. But this poem captured to me. I remember being blown away with this poem as a teenager, hearing Paul read it in 1976, and it was only written events 2 years before that, and it's his anger is there, but also his deep humanity. And it's called In Memory of Those Murdered in the Dublin Massacre, May 1974. In the grime-ridden sunlight, in the downtown Wimpy Bar, I think of all the crucial aeons and of the labels that freedom fighters stick onto the lost destinies of unborn children. The early morning sunlight carries in the whole street from outside, the whole wide street from outside through the plate glass windows, wholly, sparklingly, surgingly carried in from outside, and the waitresses cannot help but be happy and gay as they swipe at the tabletops with their dishcloths. Such a moment as would provide the heroic freedom fighter with his perfect meat. And I think of these heroes, heroes, heroes. And as I stand up to walk out, the aproned old woman who's been sweeping the floor has mop stuck in bucket leaning on it, and she's trembling all over like a flower in the breeze. She'd make a mighty fine explosion now if you were to blow her up, an explosion of petals of aeons, and the waitresses too, flying breasts and limbs for a free Ireland. That poem I still see Paul on stage reading that poem in 1976. And the poem before the pandemic, I used to go bring Paul shopping for a year or two every Monday morning in Ringsend. And as we would talk, he would always go back to Turlock in Mayo, where Paul was from. I wrote 2 novels about a woman called Sheila Fitzgerald, who taught Paul how to paint as a child. And actually, Paul turns up in the novel An Arc of Light as a young boy and then as a young man in London. And it was all based on Paul's memories of Sheila at the time. And Turlock meant an awful lot to Paul. And we would talk about his father and his aunt who ran the shop, and his grandfather who, the Civil War, the IRA tried to rob the shop in the Civil War, and the grandfather said, "Shoot me against the gable, you're getting nothing." And how that family, and then the Fitzgerald family, and Paul's memories of going there. And so this poem, Going Home to Mayo, winter 1949, always meant so much to me, because I can imagine that journey of Paul making that journey to Mayo. Leaving behind us the alien, foreign city of Dublin, my father drove to the night in an old Ford Anglia, his 5-year-old son in the seat beside him, the Lexan seat of the red leatherette, and a yellow moon peered in through the windscreen. "Daddy, Daddy," I cried, "pass out the moon." But no matter how hard he drove, he could not pass out the moon. Every town we passed through was another milestone, and our names were magic passwords into eternity, Kilcock, Kinnegad, Strokestown, Effin, Tunavary, Tusk, Ballinvary, Ballavary. Then we were in Mayo, and the next stop was Tulloch, the village of Tulloch in the heartland of Mayo, and my father's mother's house, all eye lamps and women, and my bedroom over the public bar below. And in the morning, cattle cries and cock crows, life's seemingly endless garment gloriously rent by their screeches and bellowings. And in the evening, I walked with my father in the high grass down by the river, talking to him, an unheard of thing in the city. But home was not home, and the moon could no more be outflanked than the daylight nightmare of Dublin city. Back along the canal we chugged into the city, and each lock gate tiled a mutual doom, and railings and palings and asphalt and traffic lights and blocks after blocks of so-called new tenements, thousands of crosses of loneliness planted in the narrowing grave of the life of a father in the wide open cemetery of the boy's childhood. As I say, I read with Paul in Canada a few times, and we were in Halifax, Nova Scotia, doing a reading. And I said, have you ever read here before? And he said, yes, he said, I was invited to the Ancient Order of Bernians, had a St. Patrick's Day celebration, and they asked me to be the guest speaker. And I said, how did it go? And he said, well, didn't go great, he said. I read the opening lines of the Kilfenora T-Boy. I'm the Kilfenora T-Boy, I'm not so very young. And though the land is going to pieces, I will not take up the gun. And a large, fat Canadian Irishman in a sash stood up and punched me. And I said, well, it's a very definite response to the poem, Paul, you know. So actually, I always loved the Kilfenora T-Boy, and I always think of somebody becoming a critic after several large whiskies and 4 lines of poetry. And so hopefully nobody will punch me even if I make a dog's dinner reading this poem. The Kilfenora T-Boy. I'm the Kilfenora T-Boy. I'm not so very young, but though the land is going to pieces, I will not take up the gun. I am happy making tea. I make lots of it when I can, and when I can't, I just make do. And I do a little bit of sheep farming on the side. Or what is the small bit of furze between 2 towns that makes the Kilfenora T-Boy really run. I have 9 healthy daughters, and please God, I will have more. Sometimes my dear wife's beat me, but on the whole, she's a gentle soul. When I'm not making her some tea, I sit and watch them all ring-a-rosing in the street, and I do a little bit of sheep farming on the side. Oh, but it's the small bit of furze between 2 towns is what made the Kilfenora T-Boy really run. Oh, indeed, my wife is handsome. She has a fire lighting in every eye. You can pluck laughter from her elbows, and from her knees pour money's tears. I make all my tea for her. I'm her T-Boy on the hill. And I also attach her rope, and I do a little bit of sheep farming on the side. But oh, it's the little bit of furze between 2 towns is what makes the Kilfenora T-Boy really run. I'm not only a famous T-Boy, I'm a famous caveman too. I paint pictures by the 100, but you can't sell walls. Although the people praise my pictures as well as my tough perfume blend, they rarely fling a fiver in my face. But oh, don't we do an awful lot of dying on the side. But oh, it's a little bit of furze between 2 towns is what makes the Kilfenora T-Boy really run. And when I read that poem and I come to the line, they rarely fling a fiver in your face, I always think of the story of that actually Charles Haughey told me, on my only ever conversation with Charles Haughey, of being with Patrick Kavanagh. I think this is an archetypal story because I've heard about it. And Kavanagh saying, what's this new thing that they're all discussing? The new thing young people have. And he says, what is it? The new thing, they all have it. Existentialist angst. What the hell is that? And so I explained to him roughly it, and Kavanagh said, oh, there's no existentialist angst that a fistful of fivers flung in your face wouldn't cure. So I suspect that's where Paul got that line from, you know. As I say, Raven Arts Press published 3 of Paul's books. And I remember sitting in with a manuscript of Jesus Break His Fall in my father's house with the poet Michael O'Loughlin, and we were not alone. We also had a large bag of cannabis grown by the poet, the late poet Conor O'Connor, but we had nothing to smoke up with. And we were sitting reading this manuscript of poems that had arrived from Cork from Paul Durcan. And we were young kids. In some ways, it's extraordinary publishing. In some ways, it's a disgrace that a poet like Paul Durcan was being published by 2 kids from Finglas. But that was the way Ireland was at that time. And this poem just meant so much to us. I remember just the excitement of reading this poem on the page. In the same way, the excitement of hearing Paul read that first poem in the play was just this poem came alive on the page. And it's called The Death by Heroin of Sid Vicious. There, but for the clutch of luck, go I. At daybreak, in the Arctic fog of a February daybreak, shoulder-length helmets in the watchtowers of the concentration camp caught me out in the intersecting arcs of the swirling searchlights. There were at least a zillion of us caught out there, like ladybuds under a boulder. But under the microscope, each of us was unique, and we broke for cover, crazily breasting the barbed wire, and some of us made it to the forest edge, but many of us did not make it, although their unborn children did, such as you, whom the camp commandant branded Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols, Jesus Breakers Fall. There, but for the clutch of luck, go we all. I want to finish with a poem from a much later book called Praise in Which I Live and Move and Have My Being. And I think it's a poem that captured Paul's love affair with Achill Island. I never heard Paul read it aloud, but I always thought it captured his relationship and his love of Achill so well. And so I'd like to read it here. And it's called Achill Island Postman. Driving up the rocky track to the 5 barred gate of the cottage on the mountain on the western sea, I look to see if atop the locked black mailbox is there a nugget of white quartz. The sort of man the postman is Tom Gillis. If he's been here and dropped mail in my box, he picks up a nugget of white quartz from the churned up, washed up earth, placing it on top of the locked black mailbox. Every day, 5 days a week, in snowstorms and anti-cyclones, he zips up and down the mountain and the valleys, the boreens, the braes, the rights of way, in a dinky green van delivering the mail. He who lives for his family, his wife and his children, and following Premier League soccer and Sky TV. Quartz, the only metaphorical icon we have for the soul and the life of the soul. Ireland is chock-a-block with greedy, sneaky, cutthroats, vainglorious men. But the postman is somebody else, a one-man rescue service, his throwaway laughter glistening on the black horizon. Thank you all very much.
Waiting for the music. Oh my goodness, and also absorbed by that reading by Dermot, because I'm not nervous, but I'm increasingly unnerved, because I don't know Paul Durcan personally. I'm a reader. I've been a reader of his poetry ever since I learned about him, which was in 1992. So I was out of the country for more than 20 years. And I didn't know about Paul Durcan. I came back, and quite soon after coming back, a good friend, Paul Gillespie in Dublin, he was so excited, he said, you have to go and you have to hear this poet. You must go and hear Paul Durcan. So, a reading came up soon afterwards in Hodges Figgis in Dublin, and I went. And I was completely thrown because I couldn't understand, I couldn't hear a word of it. There was a really low register mumble from this wonderful poet I'd come to hear. So I came away really a bit confused, but I bought his book, and I think what I bought was probably Daddy Daddy, because it had come out shortly before. But thereafter, so I got into his poetry reading, and reading his poetry, and thereafter I went to many readings with huge pleasure, and never had, never met that Paul Durcan again. But each time there's a reading, it's the little frisson of anticipation. What's he going to be like tonight, which added to the pleasure. So that's me feeling slightly a bit of an imposter here. But at the same time, poets need readers who don't know them. I think also poetry is what's on the page for strangers as well as for their friends. But I'm going to start somewhere completely different, which is, I want to read a poem by a friend of Paul Durcan's, who died not so long ago, the poet Pierce Hutchinson. And why I want to read it is, for me, it shows a side of a very young Paul Durcan in London, aged 25, I think my maths is right, in 1970. He's there with young Paul, with his young wife Nessa, 2 babies. Phone call from Pierce Hutchinson, who was gay and was in London, got gay bashed, basically, got beaten up. And here's the poem. Paul and Nessa. Paul, you brought us in. Nessa said to us. At 3 a.m, she said, come to us. At 4 a.m, you opened the door to us. At 3 a.m, by 4 broken phones, by 1 phone that worked, by 2 lucky 6-penny bits, by 5 cruising taxis who turned us away, by 1 taxi that took us, by 2 blood-soaked hankies dropped on the nightmare street, by a long, desolate street, by fear of pursuers to finish the job. We didn't know which way to turn. We didn't know which way led to you at 4 a.m, by grace of friendship, by grace of poetry, by grace of marriage, we came to you. We came home to you, Paul. Nessa, we came homing. Sarah, Shefra, did we wake you up? We came home. By grace of electricity, by grace of petrol, by grace of greed, by grace of money, we crossed London. When we got to your gate, your window was lit. You were standing there already in the lighted doorway, at the open door, at the open. After us, you gave us a drink and a place to sleep. You listened. You washed my face gently. You washed the blood from swelling flesh. At 3 a.m, in the terrifying city, well within hearing of the beast, by 4 broken phones, by 2 lucky 6-penny bits, by 2 red hankies, by the rending pain of coughing through beaten ribs, by the broken sleeping of 2 small children, by the strength of 2 tired people, not too tired, we came to you, out of despair, onto a skellig of hope. Oh, it was difficult landing, but you made it easy. Out of your difficulty, we had it easy. Whatever blood, whatever grime I snuffle, stumble, blubber through, from now till the blood-stained hanky drops in my nightmare street, I'll get washed in memory, clean, made whole again. By Nessa telling us come, by Paul standing waiting at the lighted open door. So it's a long poem, but I just find it incredibly moving. I share with this Paul I've never met, I share Rathgar in Dublin and Westport. I live half an hour west of Westport near Lewisburg. And I just love the way he writes with such intimate knowledge of the landscape around Westport. And it is literally this, so I'm going to read Asylum Seeker, because I consider Mayo my place of asylum also. So we move to Mayo. Hurtling along the road from Castlebar to Westport, in my filthy 2-door bottle green Opel Astra, the last stage of the drive from Dublin, 5 miles out from Westport, I catch my first glimpse of Croagh-Patrick, the mountain of my birth, being stark gently, bluely, greyly. Croagh-Patrick, the reek, Ararat of Armenia, let no Turk try to still my feet, O Westport in the light of Asia Minor, the mountain whose long hands are steepled in prayer, whose 10 fingers are twinned at their tips, posing the question to which no man of salt knows the answer. My head drops onto the driving wheel, my accelerator sobs. For I am almost home. Here only is where I can call home, under the Westport skyline, where I know I can seek asylum, where 7,000 years ago, when sea wrestled sky, Noah also did seek asylum. Here is where I can drop dead in the sub-zero dawn outside any man's front door and not be rolled over and kicked into the gutter. Here is where the young curate will bless my old man's baby corpse, and a pass the hat round will get me a cubbyhole in the clay in Achawal Cemetery, under the McBride cairn, under the holy mountain of my birth, Croagh-Patrick on the Westport skyline. Tonight at twilight, I land into Westport from Dublin, into a huddle of snowdrops under a scarf of crows in the schoolyard of the bare treetops at playtime, bedtime, cawing, cackling, chasing, circling, and one yellow crocus under an aged lime, and green schools of daffodils about to wake up in their fate of gold. 3 days before Ash Wednesday, I fling up into the darkening sky the pancakes of my soul and jump into the arms of my fleeting goddaughter as she steps up into a white minibus to transport her to her bower. The next one I'd like to read again, it's Mayo, and I have a personal reading if you wanted to read it. It's from Daddy Daddy, and it's the Mayo accent. And the reason I want to read it is because I've been living now for 25 years outside Louisburg. I've been coming there for 40 years, and I have the best neighbours, the best people you could find anywhere. And of course they don't speak like you speak in Dublin. But when my friends say, and how is it going down in the West? I just get so annoyed. I get so annoyed. I feel it's insulting, it's condescending, it's discriminatory, everything. Anyway, that's my little rant about the West. And I love this poem. I love the language in it. Have you ever tuned into the voice of a Mayo man? In his mouth, the English language is sphagnum moss under the bare, braceleted feet of a pirate queen. Syllables are blooms of tentativeness in bog cotton. Words are bog oak sunk in understatement. Phrases are bog water in which syllables float, or in which speakers themselves are found floating face upwards or downwards. Conversations are smudges of bogland under cloudy skies. Speech in Mayo is a turbary function, to be exercised as a turbary right, with turbary responsibilities and turbary irresponsibilities. Peat smoke of silence unfurls over turf fires of language. A man with a Mayo accent is a stag at bay upon a bog rock with rabbits round its hooves. Why then, Daddy, did you shed the pricey antlers of your Mayo accent for the tree-felling voice of a harsh judiciary whose secret headquarters were in the home counties or High Germany? Your son has gone back to Mayo to sleep with the island woman who talks so much she does not talk at all. If he does not sleep with her, she will kill him, the pirate queen. And I just two more shortish poems I want to read. The next one I want to read is 4 lines long, but I have to give a little introduction because exactly 20 years ago this year I was just getting into writing poetry. I was really in that kind of really feverish state where I just all living only for poetry and writing poetry. And I did a week-long writing course with McDara Woods, and it was fantastic. But while I was here, I needed to eat one evening, and I asked people, where can I go? And they said, oh, well, go to Gray's guest house. You probably get something to eat there. And I did, and I discovered there was an entrance exam for getting, for anyone of you know what I'm talking about. I was asked to wait while this lovely elderly woman, who turned out to be Vi McDougall, checked in the dining room, was there any room, came back and I was allowed in. But the funniest thing for me was, because what I should have said at the beginning, I'm fascinated by Paul Durcan's fascination with Protestants. comes up over and over in his poems. He has this kind of thing about, what's a Protestant and Protestants. And Vi she was desperate to know Geraldine Mitchell. Mitchell? Geraldine? And so she wanted to know, she said things like, Gary, I don't remember his name now. What was his name? Huh? Hastings. Gary Hastings is my rector in Westport. Is he yours too? And I just said, I believe he's a wonderful traditional musician. I just wasn't, because my childhood in Dublin was fighting this off. People always, like in the north of Ireland, they'd get you by your surname, where you lived and all the rest. So anyway, but I got her, she was wonderful, and I actually wrote, after she died, I wrote a piece for Sunday Miscellany, and I had great fun writing it. So here, now you can have the poem. It's 4 lines long, and it's called Vi. At 93, she's a young girl laughing at midnight in her doorway. She cries, "Come again, come again." Exhausted, I limp away. So I just love that. And I'm going to end, and I hope I haven't been too long, I'm going to end with kind of linking up the Paul Durcan here in this part of Mayo with where I am, which is just about a mile as the crow flies, not fries, from where Michael Longley wrote a lot of his poems in Carrick-Skeowan. So I want to read Michael Longley's last poetry reading, because I just love the language and the imagery. And I want to thank John McHugh for asking me to be here, because although I as I keep saying, I don't know Paul Durcan personally, but I didn't hesitate. I just said yes immediately. And I had such a good time getting all my Paul Durcans down off the shelves and going through them and choosing. So thank you. It's wonderful. Michael Longley's last poetry reading. On the occasion of his last poetry reading as Ireland Professor of Poetry in Trinity College, Dublin, while in the tiered lecture theatre the expectant audience perched, chattering on its boughs, Michael Longley sent word that he himself could not attend on account of being detained by 2 Vermeer women in a nearby restaurant called the Pig's Ear, but that in his place a pair of red braces would give the reading. And so it was. For almost 1 hour on an empty stage, a pair of red braces with a white beard gave the most memorable reading ever given in Trinity College. A red robin on a telegraph wire in a blue sky at dusk could not have been more pitch perfect, note acute, breast erect, vanished from our cobblestones, how we shall miss him. So thank you.
The musicians are fighting here.
Just enjoying thinking about Paul, and it's great to be part of this. So we have a little tune. It's actually one of Turlough O'Carolan's, and it's his first composition. So you mentioned Fitzgerald there, Castlebar. So Mary Fitzgerald from Turlough House married MacDermot Rowe up in Ballyfernan and Roscommon, and she became Carolan's patron and set him up after he got smallpox and over a few years became blind. She set him up with harp lessons and a harp and a guide, and for his first day out on the job, sent him to a friend of hers and warned the friend, look, it's his first time, will you mind him, kind of thing. Sent him off, and he played for this man Reynolds, and he wasn't too enamored with what he was playing. And he said, why don't you compose some of your own tunes? And Carolyn was like, oh, like, and he was a bit lost. And your man said, well, there's great stories around here, like She Beg, She More, the great fight between the big fairies and the fairies. So this is his first composition. It's pretty amazing. So if it was my first tune now, I'd be, yeah.
My memory of Paul is here in this church and him reading and holding the whole audience mesmerized. And I think some people were wondering, would he bring or mention them in his poems? And some of them were terrified. And, you know, I mean, Paul, as some of the others have said, he loved Achill for its silence, but he also enjoyed very much the company of sitting around the fire, or sitting around the table with a cup of tea with other people. He enjoyed that company, and that was very important to him too, and you see that coming out in his poetry. The two poems that I'm going to read have Achill connections. So the first one may not seem, but it's called Cathedral Woods of Monhegan. It was to Ohio, the hills of home, I always went back, and to Achill Island up the west coast of the island of Ireland. But above all, to Monhegan Island off Maine. In the cathedral woods of Monhegan, I painted trees as the persons trees really are. The visceral spirituality of their light and shade. And in Achill Island, cliffs and portraits with my eyes closed. Hundreds and hundreds of portraits of children and women. And a lady, not a woman, but a lady named Kiddo Sheridan, and the odd old man. But now that I am aged 64 and dying in New York City of prostate cancer in St. Luke's Hospital, room 521, Bob, you've run out of vim, cries my wife, Marjorie Organ. It is in my paintings of the cathedral woods on Monhegan Island, 1911, that I see everything. All I ever attempted in a painting, with oil on canvas and with that palette, the Maratha palette. Cathedral Woods is one of my Vincent paintings that works. Van Gogh. Nick always said that despite appearances, I had the Dutch thing. Only that my Dutch thing in Cathedral Woods is calmer. Cathedral Woods on Monhegan Island, so what is it all about? In these trees are all the people I have loved. But is it not every island the same? Every woods, light and shade, but only if you gaze lightly enough, a woman's face, a woman sitting up against a tree, her red skirt, her blue blouse, all I ever wanted to know of fleeting life and therefore eternity, of comradeship, of married love, of conversation, of memory. In 6 weeks in the summer of 1911 on Monhegan Island, I painted 290 oils. Rumble, man, rumble. Of course, I had my new wife, Marjorie Organ, in my corner, but not exclusively. All the women I adored in my life are there also, along with my people, I call them. The children, the thousands of children, all of those in Cathedral Woods in silence, in light and shade, in shade and light. And all with the Hardesty Maratha palette. Now there's a story. Let's walk over the mountain to Kiel and Duat, and let me tell you about Hardesty G. Maratha and his painstaking, miraculous palette. And after dinner back in Boycott's house, imagine, I bought Captain Boycott's house for a song, the infamous land agent's mansion. Evicting tenant farmers was what gave him the kicks. With my own dollars and dimes, for Maxim Gorky's sakes. But let me tell you about the greatest Yeats of them all, greater even than his two sons, greater even than Jack B. Yeats, the painter, or his brother poet, William. Their ancient, itinerant painter father, John Butler Yeats, with whom I spent many nights down the years, when the years were apocalyptically young, in Petit Pas French restaurant in Greenwich Village, with good man John Sloan and all the new old believers. John Butler Yeats, the prodigal father. William Michael Murphy, the scholar, named him. The greatest ever speaker of the English language and portrait painter extraordinaire. All in Cathedral Woods. Cathedral Woods indeed, indeedio. Not to mention that day back in Toledo, Ohio, that woman called Emma Goldman, and that wow of the anarchist, her lecture on Tolstoy in Toledo, Ohio. There also was a prodigal woman, also almost as great as John Butler Yeats, the prodigal father, hiding out in New York City, where now I lie dying, 12th of July, 1929, the 8th man, only 14 days after my 64th birthday, a tumbler of water, merci bien, mon chéri, a tumbler of water, Derrienne. The second poem, I wasn't supposed to read this because our chairperson, Kathleen Carr Smith, was supposed to read this, but Kathleen cannot be with us, so she asked me to read it, and it's dedicated to her parents. So, Kathleen, this is also for you. Slievemore Cemetery Headstones. 1. Cathy Carr, 1929-1995. She is my song, my turf stack, my whitewashed wall. She is my house in the hill up above me. She is my young woman facing west. She is my seashell I place to my ear. She is my ocean I go to sleep and wake up to. 2. Michael Carr, 1929-2009. He is my man across the Irish Sea, my hero of fidelity, who every Friday sends me home his wages to rear our family. Stepping off the bus at the crossroads with his suitcase, his cardboard boxes of dolls, a sailboat, a tricycle. He is home now for good, beside me forever. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Excuse me. I would like to read two poems by and for Paul Durcan, but I will read them twice. Once in the original form and then in a different guise, namely in my German translation. The thing is, Paul Durcan's poetry, I find, is sadly underrepresented in Germany. There's only one volume, as far as I know. Now the title, you might have to help me, Berlin Café. Berlin Café, it's part of the title. Anyway, that's the title of the German collection. And it was done by my friend Jürgen Schneider some time ago, but nothing ever followed that. So I thought that for tonight I would translate two of Paul Durcan's poems into German, and you will obviously then witness a world premiere. They are taken from a collection called Give Me Your Hand, and they are poems inspired by paintings in the National Gallery, London. And I find it must be quite a difficult feat to achieve when you write poems about paintings, because obviously the poems should be able to live even without the paintings printed side by side. All the same, I have brought with me just two copies, one of a painting by Jan van Eyck, and the other one a painting by Nicholas Mays. And if you just have a very short glimpse and pass them on, then you can at least see the parallels or not between painting and poem. One more thing that strikes me is, for example, the first painting was made in 1434, the Arnolfini Marriage, quite a well-known painting. And now that painting speaks to somebody when was the collection published? In 1994. So I think that says something about the power of the arts. I will read first the German so that you who do not have any German can just get used to the sound and all that, but I see 1 or 2 or 3 German speakers, so it's for them in particular, and then I read the original, okay? Paul Durcan, Arnolfini-Hochzeit. Wir sind die Arnolfini. Glauben Sie ja nicht, Sie dürften in unsere Intimsphäre eindringen, denn das dürfen Sie nicht. Wir lassen uns porträtieren. Das erotischste Porträt, das je gefertigt wurde. Denn wir haben Vertrauen in den Künstler. Dass er gerecht wird der Mehrzahl, Fruchtbarkeit, Häuslichkeit, Barfüßigkeit eines Mannes und einer Frau, die sagen, wir. Dass er gerecht wird unserem Bett, unserem unerlässlichsten Möbelstück. Dass er gerecht wird unserem Leben als Spiegelung. Unsere Hirne ergießen sich auf den Boden und der Terrier zu unseren Füßen schnuppert die kleinsten Details unserer Größe. Das erholsamste Wort in unserem Wortschatz lautet wir. Stellen Sie sich vor, wir sagen zu können. Die meisten Menschen sind nicht in der Lage, wir zu sagen. Sind Sie es, die Sie alleine essen, alleine schlafen und im Morgengrauen zur Arbeit radeln mit einem am Lenker festgebundenen Schäferhund? Wir halten jetzt inne zum Angelus. Bitte, hier haben Sie es, die 2 Hälften der Kokosnuss. The Arnolfini Marriage. We are the Arnolfinis. Do not think you may invade our privacy because you may not. We are standing to our portrait, the most erotic portrait ever made, because we have faith in the artist to do justice to the plurality, fertility, domesticity, barefootedness of a man and a woman saying, we. To do justice to our bed as being our most necessary furniture, to do justice to our life as a reflection. Our brains spill out upon the floor and the terrier at our feet sniffs the minutiae of our magnitude. The most relaxing word in our vocabulary is we. Imagine being able to say we. Most people are in no position to say we. Are you, who eat alone, sleep alone, and at dawn cycle to work with an Alsatian shepherd dog tied to your handlebars? We will pause now for the Angelus. Here you have it, the 2 halves of the coconut. The second poem is by Nicholas Mays, if I pronounce his name correctly, and it is called Interior with a Sleeping Maid and Her Mistress, and that painting comes from the year 1655. Again, the German first. Mit den Mägden geht's bergab. Schauen Sie sich meine an. Schauen Sie sie an, diese Visage. Depression mindestens. Was kommt als nächstes? Beklagt sich, sie sei erschöpft, weil sie mit meinem Sohn schlafen muss. Was glaubt sie wohl, wofür ich sie bezahle? Fürs Geschirrspülen? Fürs Pfannenscheuern? Fürs Töpfe ausbeulen? Mein lieber kleiner Sohn Tom mag sein Speigerl Brust und er ist ein neugieriger kleiner Bub, weswegen ich ihr 1 Penny die Woche zahle, damit sie ihn sexuell aufklärt und mir die Küche sauber hält. 1 Penny die Woche mag Ihnen wenig vorkommen. Für mich, verheiratet mit einem Börsenmakler in Godalming, ist es viel. Ich habe alle Hände voll damit zu tun, der Herr behüte mich, bei Tageslicht im Vorderzimmer Bridge zu spielen. Interior with a sleeping maid and her mistress. Maids are gone to pot. Look at my maid. Depression, no less. What next? Complains that she's worn out from having to make love to my son. What does she think I pay her for? For washing up dishes? For scouring pans? For walloping pots? My dear little son Tom likes a slice of breast, and he's a curious little boy, which is why I pay her a penny a week to instruct him in the facts of life and to keep it clean in my kitchen. A penny a week may not be much to you, but it is a lot to me, married as I am to a stockbroker in Godalming. I have my hands full, the Lord love me, playing daylight bridge in the front parlor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Sorry for the little hold up there. Musicians are very temperamental. We're just trying to discover we're just trying to decide what to play. And of course we had this Metlishi earlier, and we said a lot of events like this, we just say, look, we'll get the feel, we'll get the vibe, and hopefully we'll play something that's appropriate. So we're going to play a waltz actually. It's a Scottish tune, Margaret's Waltz. So if there are any Margarets out there, you can go out and, I see one down the back. You can go dancing if you want. I have no information on it at all, other than it's Scottish, and I'd love to play it, so you have to listen to it. So I hope you enjoyed it anyway. Margaret's Waltz.
like my friend Dermot, I first encountered Paul Durcan as a teenage courier, and we're still teenage couriers at heart. And
Teenage girls were put past, Michael.
well, that's true. We've earned it. And I always remember the first time I saw Paul reading, and the impression that I had was I'd never really seen anybody perform a poem before with that much attention to the actual sound of a poem and the way people heard it. Because I think as a poet, as a beginning poet, I was concentrated on imagery and ekphrastic imagery and meaning. And Paul made me realize that the sound is just as important. And that was a huge influence on me, for which I'm very grateful to him. So after that, I tended to start writing poetry in my head and reciting it and rehearsing it before I actually wrote it down. And I was reciting it to my inner ear. And of course, my inner ear was eventually replaced by iPhone memos. And I was looking through an iPhone memo, desperately looking for inspiration a few weeks ago. And I came across a very short memo from a couple of years ago. And it was only 3 words: deconstructed cardboard boxes. And I suddenly felt the spirit of Paul. And so when the first poem I want to read is a poem that is the grandfather of deconstructed cardboard boxes, and it's called That Propeller I Left in Bilbao. Would you like a whiskey? Good, that's my girl. How I do like to see you with a glass of whiskey in your hand, and that gleam of a smile beneath your hat. And that gleam of a smile beneath your hat. But that propeller I left in Bilbao, I ought to tell you about it now. But blast it, I won't. Let's have a row. Ow, 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 let's have a row. Let's pink the pink floor, pinker than pink. I am a pink place in which a pink pig plashes. You are a pink peach in which a pink babe perishes. Perishes to be born. Put in a new cassette and let the cherry blossom blossom till it fall asunder. Oh, my pink thunder, asunder. And that propeller I left in Bilbao is still that propeller I left in Bilbao. But you have sheared off all your robes, and you would like, if it pleases me, a second whiskey. Why, of course, my big pink Thunderbird. My big pink Thunderbird. Why, of course. Do you know how many telephone calls I had today? The flaming phone never stopped flaming, ringing, and all about that propeller I left in Bilbao. All about that propeller I left in Bilbao. I said, telex to them all. Telex. And now to you, love, telex forever and forever, telex. And may that propeller I left in Bilbao, well, may that propeller I left in Bilbao, that propeller I left in Bilbao, propeller I left in Bilbao, I left in Bilbao. I think if we talk about, we're talking about Paul here as a poet, but I think I'd just like to say a little word about Paul and his importance in Irish culture, even outside of poetry. And one of the things that made him so important was, well, many of you, I won't say most of you, many of you will remember Ireland in the 70s and 80s. And it was basically an authoritarian state with a very rigid Catholic and nationalist ethos. And there was really no room for any kind of imaginative thinking. And if you wanted imaginative thinking, you were told, well, you know, feck off to London or Paris or Harvard or Stanford or whatever you're having yourself. And in order to break out of that, we needed people to imagine alternative Irelands. Now, the people who should have been doing that were politicians, economists, urban designers, town planners, architects, clergymen of all denominations, but they weren't doing it. The only people who were doing it were poets and, to give them their due, journalists. And that was a bit of a burden, really, that we shouldn't have had to deal with. But I think that's what the most important thing that Paul did in a way, was he constantly imagined alternative Irelands. So that created a kind of a space that people could breathe in. And the next poem I'm going to read is one about this. Backside to the Wind. A 14-year-old boy is out rambling alone by the scimitar shores of Killala Bay, and he's dreaming of a French Ireland, backside to the wind. What kind of village would I now be living in? French vocabularies intertwined with Gaelic, and Irish women with French fathers, backsides to the wind. The Ballina Road would become the Rue Humbert, and wine would be the staple drink of the people, a staple diet of potatoes and wine, backside to the wind. Monsieur Duffy might be the harbour master, and Madame Duffy, the mother of 13 tiny philosophers to overthrow Maynooth, backside to the wind. Father Malloy might be a worker priest, up to his knees in manure at the cattle mart, and dancing and loving on the streets at evening, backside to the wind. Jean-Arthur Rimbaud might have grown up here in a hillside terrace under the round tower. Would he, like me, have dreamed of an Arabian Dublin, backside to the wind? Garda and Ned MacHale might now be a gendarme having hysterics at the crossroads, excommunicating male motorists, ogling females, backside to the wind. I walk on, facing the village ahead of me, a small concrete oasis in the wild countryside, not the embodiment of the dream of a boy, backside to the wind. Seagulls and crows, priests and nuns, perch on the rooftops and steeples, and their Anglo-American moors asphyxiate me, backside to the wind. Not to mention the Japanese invasion. Blunt people as solemn as ourselves and as humorless. Money is our God, backsides to the wind. The medieval Franciscan friary of Moyne stands house high, roofless by. Past it rolls a vast asphalt pipe, backside to the wind. Ferrying chemical waste out to sea from the Asahi synthetic fibre plant, where once monks sang, wage earner's slave, backsides to the wind. Run on, sweet River Moy. Although I end my song, you are the scales of a salmon, of a boy, backside to the wind. Yet, I have no choice but to leave, and yet there is nowhere I more yearn to live than in my own wild countryside, backside to the wind. Okay, get some water. I was going to read a poem called The Haulier's Wife on the Road to Moon. But it's very long, and I'm aware, in the words of Cyril Connolly, that closing time in the Gardens of the West is approaching. So I'm going to read a shorter poem, which suddenly occurred to me, because it's a great poem, but as you will understand when I read it, in recent years it's acquired a completely different connotation. Making love outside Áras an Uachtaráin.
When I was a boy.
Uh-oh. When I was a boy, myself and my girl used bicycle up to the Phoenix Park. Outside the gates, we used to lie in the grass, making love outside Áras an Uachtaráin. Often I wondered what De Valera would have thought inside in his ivory tower, if he knew that we were in his green, green grass, making love outside Aras and Uachtaráin. Because the odd thing was, oh, how odd it was, we both revered Irish patriots, and we dreamed our dreams of a green, green flag making love outside Aras and Uachtaráin. But even had our names been Dermot and Grania, we doubted De Valera's approval for a poet's son and a judge's daughter making love outside Aras and Uachtaráin. I see him now in the heat haze of the day, blindly stalking us down, and levelling an ancient rifle, he says, "Stop making love outside Aras and Uachtaráin." Now, considering the current occupant of Aras and Uachtaráin, that poem acquires layers of meta-hilarity. So I'll finish with a very short poem, which is part of a very long poem that has all kind of personal meanings for me. And this is a poem, I don't think that Paul ever reprinted this, for Francis Stewart on his 80th birthday, Ark of the North. And we were just discussing earlier on is when Paul was signing books, he'd often write a particular phrase, "The poem is the cry of its occasion." And this particular poem was the cry of its occasion. Francis Stewart was a great friend of Paul Durcan's and complicated character, of course. And Francis Stewart once wrote a book called A Guide to Profitable Gambling on Horses in Britain or Ireland. Don't you can correct me there? No? It was a manual for gambling. Yeah, it was a bestseller. Now, I grew up in a household where everybody was a big bettor on horses, and all my uncles and stuff, and I spent a lot of my childhood on race courses, which was very educational. And in many houses all over the world, in some houses, the Virgin Mary and Jesus Christ were the household gods, or in some houses it was Zeus and Aphrodite or Buddha. In my household in Finglas, the household gods were Lester Piggott and Arkle. So I always loved this part of the poem, but it also sums up a lot about Paul, I think. So this is from Ark of the North. Soon, like two girls discussing a boy, oblivious to the scenic coastline, we were discussing the beauty of Lester Piggott. Lester gets his cigars in Arthur Fox's in College Green on account of the fact that Fox's give Lester's wife, Susan, tips on where in Dublin to get things cheap. Underwear, lingerie, and all that class of gear. Lester was not pleased when the press discovered that he had spent time in a nudist camp, but Susan stood by him. She always does. Lester drives cars backwards at the same speed as you and I drive them forwards. I can well believe the yarn about my namesake parting the waters of, where was it? Yes, indeed, the Red Sea. After I saw Lester Piggott driving a car backwards on a horny road in Berkshire. Okay. Thank you, Paul.
So we're almost concluded, but there is one voice which should be heard tonight, even though he's not here. So we're going to have a poem, My Father, by Paul Durcan.
Dear Daddy, on your last legs now, can you hear me in your bedroom in the treetops, chained to your foot warmer and your pills, death notices in newspapers, your exclusive reading? We had no life together, or almost none. Yet you made me what I am, a man in search of his Russia. After school days, I became a poet, a metamorphosis you could no more fathom than I could fathom your own osmosis, lawyer with a secret life, as secret as the life of a poet. You had a history for every milestone, a saga for every place name, the Bovril sign, the ballast office clock, the broadstone. And so, at your knee, at your elbow, I became you. Estranged as we are, I am glad that it was in this life I loved you, not the next. O Russian night at the crossroads, if you turn to the right, you will lose your horse. To the left, your head. If you go straight on, your life. If you were me, which you are, night at the crossroads, you would go home to Russia this very night.
There's confusion there because we had planned to have a recording of Making Love outside Oros an Uachtaráin. But Michael O'Loughlin beat us to it. I would like to thank our panel of readers this evening for a very interesting and varied selection of poems. Not all Paul Durcan's poems, but all very much linked. And I'd like to thank them for their time here. And I'd like also to thank our two wonderful musicians, Leisha and Diarmuid, who are now going to play us out. Good night.
Thank you. Are we on there? Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. Am I on there, John? On, yes, right. Action. Am I good? I'm good, sorry. No, just something, most enjoyable evening. Thanks very much for the invitation. Thanks to the Heinrich Böll Association. But just to touch on something that was a common theme, and three of the contributors here had mentioned it, and talking about Paul. In a previous life, I was a shopkeeper in Dua, and anytime that Paul was in Achill, he would come in. And as Geraldine said, sometimes you wouldn't know which Paul would arrive at the door, you know. And there was one particular occasion he came in, and he was somber, and a lady followed in right behind him quickly, as if to say, you know, I want to talk to this man. And Paul headed down the back of the shop to get the guardian, I think. And this lady stopped at the till and she said, is that Paul Durcan? And of course I said, no, I don't think so. I don't think so. Yeah. And she goes, oh, okay, so she scampered off anyway, and Paul made his way up to the till a few minutes later and did his transaction with a newspaper and a litre of milk. And he says, I said, thanks very much, Paul. He says, thank you, Diarmuid. Thank you. So, and another thing that Diarmuid mentioned was you mentioned Charlie Haughey, and I was lucky enough to be, myself and my wife and my kids were lucky enough to be invited to the Abbotshangy, to John McHugh and Maggie Morrison's house for dinner one New Year's Day. What we didn't know was Paul Durcan was also invited. And we sat around the table, and John McHugh was cajoling and coaxing Paul to tell this story about him being invited to read at the opening of Knock Airport by Charlie Haughey. And I think, as Michael said, when you got Paul Durcan on form, he could deliver a story. And it's just, some of you may have heard it, but I'll take the story with me to the grave. It was absolutely phenomenally entertaining. So we're going to play these out for Paul and for everybody here. What are we playing? Mayo tunes. Oh, lovely. 4 Mayo tunes. Great. Thanks again.
Thank you.